The auction ignored a deserted trading post, and in the winter of 1883, in the high desert town of Silver Wash, New Mexico Territory, that indifference suited Cassandra Boyle perfectly well, for she was 36 years old, widowed twice over by circumstance if not by ceremony, and had exactly $13 to her name after her father-in-law, a cattle broker named Reuben Boyle, had produced a debt paper claiming her late husband owed him the whole value of their small freight business, and had the sheriff empty her house of everything but a single trunk while the neighbors watched from their porches and said nothing at all. With that $13, Cassandra walked to the edge of town where the county was clearing derelict properties from its tax rolls, and there, at an auction so poorly attended that the auctioneer barely troubled to read the full description aloud, she bought the old Vasquez trading post, shuttered and forgotten for 9 years, standing alone on the dry wash road where the freight route used to run before the railroad made it obsolete. Everyone who witnessed the sale considered it the last foolish act of a woman finally broken by grief and bad luck. They did not know that behind a single loose stone in that trading post's back wall waited the final secret of a man who had vanished under suspicion 9 years before, a secret that would clear his name, return a fortune to the people who had earned it, and give Cassandra Boyle a purpose larger than anything Reuben Boyle could ever take from her. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Cassandra Boyle. If you have ever bought something out of pure necessity and found, later, that necessity had led you exactly where you needed to be, tell us in the comments, because this story belongs to you as much as it does to Cassandra. Cassandra had not been raised in Silver Wash at all, but in the mining camps further north, the daughter of an assayer named Elias Marsh, a quiet, exacting man who spent his days determining, ounce by careful ounce, the true value of the ore that came across his scale, and who raised his only daughter at his side rather than at any schoolhouse, since the family moved often enough that no single school ever held her more than a season. Elias taught Cassandra, from the time she was old enough to hold a hand lens steady, the patient discipline of his trade, how a stone that looked worthless to an untrained eye might carry a vein of real value running through its center, invisible until the surface was properly cracked and examined, and how, just as often, a stone that gleamed bright and promising on the outside might prove hollow or worthless the moment it was tested. Never trust the outside of a thing to tell you what's inside it, Elias used to say, turning a dull gray rock over in his weathered palm before striking it open to reveal, more often than not, exactly the vein he had suspected was hiding there. The world is full of men who want you to judge by the shine, because the shine is easy to fake and the truth underneath is not. Cassandra absorbed this lesson the way she absorbed everything from her father, in the unhurried, matter-of-fact way a child absorbs the ordinary wisdom of a beloved parent, without yet understanding how completely it would one day define the whole shape of her life. It was not only, or that Elias taught his daughter to weigh so carefully. He had spent decades among mining camps and the freight men who supplied them, watching fortunes made and lost on claims that turned out to be salted with borrowed gold to attract buyers, on partnerships that dissolved the moment one man saw an advantage in cheating the other, and he had developed, over the years, a settled distrust of any story too neatly told, any account that balanced too perfectly without a single awkward question left unanswered. An honest ledger has rough edges, he told Cassandra once, examining a claims assay records that a prospective buyer had brought him to verify, because honest work is rarely tidy. It's the too tidy story you ought to worry about. Cassandra carried this instinct forward long after her father's death from a fever when she was 22, an instinct that would prove, in the years to come, to be worth considerably more than any inheritance of coin he might otherwise have left her. She married at 24 to a freight hauler named Daniel Boyle, a broad-shouldered, good-humored man who ran wagon trains of goods and supplies along the old trade route connecting Silver Wash to the mining camps and the trading posts scattered across that stretch of high desert, a route that had, in its better years, supported a whole small economy of freighters, traders, and the indigenous and Mexican families who supplied much of the wool, hides, and woven goods that made the trade worthwhile in both directions. Daniel's father, Reuben Boyle, had built the family's freighting business a generation earlier and still held considerable influence over it even after handing the daily operations to his son. And Cassandra spent the early years of her marriage doing precisely what her father had trained her to do without ever intending such a use for it. Keeping her husband's freight manifests and payment ledgers with meticulous care, catching more than once a supplier's invoice that didn't quite balance, or a hauling fee that had been quietly inflated somewhere between the wagon and the account book. Daniel trusted her judgment on such matters completely, often joking that she had a prospector's eye for a false vein even in a column of ordinary figures. And for 11 years the two of them built a small, honest freighting operation that, while never grand, supported them comfortably and earned them a genuine respect among the traders and camp merchants who dealt with them fairly in return. It was during these years that Cassandra first came to know, if only by reputation and occasional passing acquaintance, the trader who ran the post at the dry wash crossing, a solemn, careful man named Rafael Vasquez, who had built his trading post into the most trusted stop along that stretch of route, known up and down the territory for weighing every trade honestly and never once, in 20 years of business, being credibly accused of cheating a supplier or a customer on either side of his counter. Vasquez had, Daniel told her more than once with evident admiration, an old habit of personally verifying every large shipment that passed through his post against the manifests the freighters carried, a habit born, he always said, of having once been badly cheated himself as a young trader and having sworn never to let it happen to anyone doing honest business through his post again. It was this reputation, more than any personal friendship, that made what happened to Vasquez in the winter of 1874 such a shock to everyone who had dealt with him, a story Cassandra heard secondhand in her early married years and filed away, without any sense of how directly it would one day return to reshape her own life. What Cassandra carried forward from all those years, more than any specific skill with a ledger or a hand lens, was her father's deepest conviction, tested repeatedly in her own married life and never once disproven, that the surface of a thing, whether a stone or a story or a signed document, tells you almost nothing reliable about what lies beneath it, and that patient, careful examination, however unglamorous, is the only honest path to the truth. She did not know, in those years of quiet contentment beside Daniel, how soon and how completely she would need that conviction, or how entirely it would one day be the only inheritance left to her. The fall arrived with a speed that left Cassandra very little time to prepare for it. Daniel died in the autumn of 1882, thrown from his wagon when a wheel shattered on a rough stretch of the very route he had traveled safely 1,000 times before, leaving Cassandra a widow at 36 with what she believed to be a modest but genuine claim to the freighting business she had helped build for over a decade. She had not accounted for how thoroughly Reuben Boyle's long-simmering resentment of his son's independence, and perhaps of his daughter-in-law's evident competence, could surface once Daniel was no longer present to mediate between them. Within 2 months of the funeral, Reuben produced before the circuit judge a debt agreement, dated some 7 years earlier, purportedly signed by Daniel, acknowledging a substantial loan from his father to cover early losses in the freighting business, a loan Reuben claimed had never been repaid and now entitled him, as senior creditor, to claim the business entire ahead of any widow's inheritance. Cassandra knew, with the same certainty her father's practiced hand would have known a salted claim from an honest one, that the document was invented, for she had kept every ledger the business had produced for 11 years, and no such debt had ever crossed those careful pages, and Daniel had never once, in the whole of their marriage, hidden so much as a minor expense from her, let alone a debt of that magnitude to his own father. But her certainty weighed nothing against a signature and a respected cattle broker's confident testimony before a judge who had done business with Reuben Boyle for 20 years and had met the widow only a handful of times at community gatherings. The judge found the debt agreement persuasive and gave Cassandra 30 days to satisfy the claim or surrender the business and its assets entirely. She spent those 30 days doing everything her father's old instincts told her to attempt. She searched every drawer and strongbox in the house for some scrap of paper that might contradict Reuben's debt agreement, and found nothing, for a forgery careful enough leaves no obvious trace of the truth it replaces. She asked the handful of drivers and clerks who had worked alongside Daniel for years whether any of them recalled him mentioning such a debt to his father, and found only uneasy silence. For Reuben Boyle controlled grazing contracts and cattle business that touched half the freight trade in the county, and no one wished to risk his displeasure defending a widow against her own father-in-law. She wrote to the Territorial Bank in Santa Fe asking whether any record existed there of such a loan, and received only a noncommittal reply. On the 29th day, having exhausted every path she could think to try, Cassandra packed her single trunk and walked into Silver Wash proper with $13 to her name and a grief that had scarcely begun to settle before a second, entirely different injustice piled on top of it. It was pure practical necessity, more than anything resembling hope, that brought her to the county courthouse steps on the very day a tax auction was clearing several long-abandoned properties from the rolls, among them the old Vasquez trading post at the Dry Wash Crossing, shuttered since 1874 and left to the weather and the pack rats ever since. Its story known to everyone in Silver Wash old enough to remember it, though rarely discussed in any detail. Rafael Vasquez, the story went, had vanished from his post one autumn night 9 years earlier, in the same week that a substantial payment, meant to settle a season's worth of trade credit owed to the many small suppliers and freighters who dealt through his post, disappeared along with him, leaving those suppliers unpaid and Vasquez's reputation, built over 20 careful years, destroyed in a matter of days. The post itself had simply been abandoned, considered too remote and too tainted by scandal for anyone to trouble with reopening it. And when the auctioneer read out the parcel that afternoon, the small crowd gathered mostly for other lots offered nothing but a ripple of indifferent amusement, for nobody imagined the ruin was worth the trouble of clearing. Cassandra, standing at the back of that crowd with her trunk and her $13, felt something stir in her that she could not entirely have explained to anyone watching. Perhaps only the plain, practical recognition that a building, however remote and however tainted by old scandal, was more shelter than she otherwise had, or perhaps something closer to her father's own old instinct that a story told too neatly. A man's whole reputation collapsed too completely in the span of a single week, deserved a second, more patient look before being accepted at face value. When the bidding, such as it was, opened and closed at $11 with no other interest at all, Cassandra heard her own voice offer 12, and the auctioneer, plainly unable to imagine what use a freshly widowed woman could have for a disgraced trader's abandoned post, took her money with an expression of mild, pitying amusement and handed over the deed without further comment. She traveled out to the post the following day, in the thin, clear light of a high desert winter morning, prepared to find little more than 4 walls and a leaking roof between herself and the coming cold, which by itself would have justified the $12 easily enough. The building, when she reached it, was indeed weathered by 9 years of neglect, its counter thick with dust, its shelves long since stripped of any goods worth taking. But the adobe walls themselves, built thick and true by a man who had evidently understood the desert's demands, remained sound despite the years, and Cassandra found herself moving through the small rooms with the same careful, methodical attention her father had once brought to a claim under inspection, checking walls and floors out of a habit too deeply ingrained to set aside, even in her own grief and exhaustion. It was in the back storeroom, the space that had evidently served as Vasquez's own private office and strongroom, that Cassandra's hand, running along the wall's lower course out of simple thoroughness, found a single stone that gave, very slightly, under pressure where its neighbors held perfectly firm, a difference so small that only a hand trained to feel for exactly this kind of irregularity would have noticed it at all. Her father's voice returned to her plainly in that moment. Never trust the outside of a thing to tell you what's inside it. Cassandra worked the loose stone free with the edge of a small trowel she found among the post's abandoned tools, and behind it, in a shallow cavity clearly built into the wall's original construction rather than worn open by time, she found a leather satchel, remarkably well preserved in the dry desert air, containing a thick ledger, several folded letters, and a modest but genuine sum in silver coin. She sat on the storeroom floor in the pale winter light and opened the ledger first, finding within its careful, practiced entries the whole detailed record of Rafael Vasquez's trading post business, kept with the same scrupulous honesty his reputation had always claimed, and beneath it, tucked among the ledger's final pages, a letter addressed simply to whoever might one day find it. Written, the date confirmed, in the final days before his disappearance. What Cassandra read over the following hours, and then the following days as she worked slowly through the ledger's full contents, revealed a story considerably different from the one Silver Wash had settled into believing for 9 years. Rafael Vasquez wrote that in the months before his disappearance, he had discovered that a considerable portion of the trade goods and cattle passing through his post under contracts brokered by a prominent local cattle and freight broker, contracts Vasquez had always assumed represented honest business between willing parties, were in fact being systematically undervalued on the paperwork that reached the suppliers, mostly small indigenous and Mexican families who wove and raised and hauled the goods themselves, while the same goods were resold downstream at their true, considerably higher value. The difference pocketed entirely by the broker arranging the deals. That broker, Vasquez named plainly in his careful hand, was Reuben Boyle, a young and rapidly rising cattleman at the time, who had used his growing influence over grazing rights and freight contracts to ensure that any supplier who complained too loudly about unfair valuations found their access to the trade route quietly and permanently curtailed. Vasquez had begun, his letter explained, keeping a parallel private ledger recording the true market value of every shipment that passed through his post against the value recorded on Boyle's official paperwork, intending to gather enough documented evidence to bring a formal complaint before the Territorial Trade Commission, a case he believed, once properly presented, would force restitution to the dozens of families who had been quietly cheated over several years of Boyle's careful scheme. In the final entries, written in a hand grown visibly urgent, Vasquez recorded that Boyle had somehow learned of his private accounting and had come to the post directly, not with any overt threat, but with a chillingly calm suggestion that a man in Vasquez's position, dependent on Boyle's goodwill for continued access to the grazing contracts that supplied half his trade goods, ought to consider very carefully whether pursuing such a complaint was truly worth what it would cost him. Vasquez wrote that he intended to proceed regardless, that he had arranged to meet with a territorial trade commissioner traveling through the region within the week, and that he was hiding his ledger and the season's collected trade payments behind the storeroom's loose stone, trusting the wall's construction, which he himself had built years before, to keep them safe until he could retrieve them for that meeting. The letter's final line, written in a hand that betrayed real fear beneath its careful composure, stated simply that if anything should happen to prevent his safe return, he hoped whoever eventually found this record would see that the families he had failed to protect received what they were rightfully owed. Cassandra sat with that letter for a long while in the cold storeroom, holding 9 years of an unexplained disappearance suddenly given a shape and a likely explanation, and thought of her father's voice examining some too perfectly balanced claim. It's the too tidy story you ought to worry about. The town's settled belief that Vasquez had simply absconded with the season's payments had always been, she now understood, exactly that kind of too tidy story, one that conveniently explained both his disappearance and the community's losses in a single stroke, while requiring no one to ask any harder questions about who else might have benefited from a trusted trader's sudden and permanent removal from the trade route. And she understood, with a coldness that settled deep in her chest, that the cattle broker Vasquez had named in his careful hand was the very same Reuben Boyle who had, only months earlier, produced a forged debt paper to strip her of her own husband's business, a pattern of convenient documents and confident testimony that suddenly made a great deal more sense in light of what she had just read. She went back through the ledger a second time that night, more slowly now, no longer simply absorbing the shock of what it contained, but studying it the way her father had taught her to study a claim, looking for the rough edges. An honest record always carried, and a fabricated one never quite managed to fake. She found them everywhere once she knew to look. A shipment of woven blankets valued absurdly low against its known market price in the very same week that Boyle's own household accounts, which Vasquez had apparently also tracked with a trader's habitual thoroughness, showed a considerable outlay for improvements to his ranch house. A season of hides purchased from a widow named Serafina Ortiz at barely a third of their worth, paid in scrip rather than coin, scrip that Vasquez's marginal notes. indicated had proven difficult for the widow to redeem at full value anywhere else along the route. Each entry, taken alone, might have passed as an unfortunate but ordinary hardship of frontier trade. Taken together, patiently assembled across nearly 3 years of Vasquez's careful notation, they formed a portrait of a man who had built his fortune penny by penny on the backs of people with no recourse to dispute him, and Cassandra understood that she was holding not merely a motive for silencing a traitor, but the outline of an entire scheme, one considerably larger and more deliberate than a single bad season's dealing. She did not act rashly, for she understood, from her own bitter and immediate experience with Reuben's forged claim, exactly how little a plain accusation would accomplish against a man who had spent decades building influence and respectability throughout the county. She spent the following weeks in careful, patient work, cross-referencing Vasquez's private valuations against whatever original trade manifests and territorial commerce records she could locate at the county archive, work that confirmed, entry after painstaking entry, that Boyle's official paperwork had indeed systematically undervalued goods supplied by a specific, consistent group of families along the trade route, precisely as Vasquez's ledger described. She sought out, with careful discretion, several of the older families named in those old manifests, weavers and hide traders who had dealt with the post in its final years, and found among them a quiet, long-suppressed bitterness about a trade route that had once treated them fairly under Vasquez's honest management and had grown steadily less generous in the years since, though none of them had ever possessed the documentation to prove exactly why or how. It did not take long for word to reach Reuben Boyle that the widow he had so recently and successfully dispossessed was living out at the old Vasquez post and asking careful questions about trade valuations from 9 years past, and his reaction, once he understood the direction of her inquiries, carried none of the confident, paternal authority he had displayed before the circuit judge. He rode out to the post himself and offered, with a smoothness Cassandra now recognized as the same practiced falsehood she had heard in his testimony against her, to purchase the ruined building back from her at several times what she had paid, framing it as a simple kindness toward a widow struggling with a remote and impractical property. A story so thin over what Cassandra now knew that she found it almost required effort not to let her face betray her. She declined with a courtesy that revealed nothing of what she had already found, and his tone shifted considerably once refused. His suggestion that a woman alone, already once found in debt to his family, would find few allies in Silver Wash willing to stand against him a second time, carrying an edge that confirmed, if any further confirmation had been needed, exactly how much he had to lose should Vasquez's ledger ever see daylight. The weeks that followed tested Cassandra severely. Word moved through Silver Wash that the widow at the old trading post had been discovered removing county property without authorization, an accusation vague enough to trouble the sheriff without resolving into any formal charge, and several of the family she had spoken with grew suddenly reluctant to say more. Their own grazing access and trade contracts still dependent on Boyle's continued goodwill in a county where his influence touched nearly every aspect of the cattle and freight trade. For a difficult stretch of weeks, Cassandra found herself exactly where a woman uncovering an old, inconvenient truth so often finds herself, alone and doubted, facing a man whose standing in the community dwarfed her own single trunk and a dead trader's careful ledger. There was, too, a harder trial than mere rumor, for one bitter evening a rider left at her gate a plain and signed note suggesting that a woman living alone so far from town, on a road so seldom traveled since the railroad came through, ought to consider how easily misfortune could find someone with no neighbors close enough to hear a call for help. Cassandra did not frighten easily, having buried a husband and faced a courtroom already stacked against her, but she understood the note for exactly the calculated pressure it was meant to be, and she spent one long, sleepless night weighing whether the truth she carried was worth the risk of pursuing it any further in so isolated a place. It was the memory of Serafina Ortiz's script, redeemed at a fraction of its worth because no one had ever stood beside the widow to insist on fair dealing, that steadied her resolve by morning. She resolved that she would not become one more name quietly discouraged into silence, and she wrote that same day to the young lawyer in Santa Fe, no longer merely to seek his professional help, but to ensure that a full copy of Vasquez's ledger existed safely beyond the reach of anyone who might wish it to simply disappear a second time. But she had, after all, spent her whole life learning that patient examination eventually reveals what a hurried glance misses entirely, and she understood that Vasquez's evidence, however thorough, would need corroboration and public attention to survive contact with a man of Boyle's established influence. She wrote to the Territorial Trade Commission directly, enclosing a careful summary of Vasquez's ledger alongside her own cross-referenced research from the county archive, and found, to her considerable relief, that the commission still retained records of the very meeting Vasquez had arranged 9 years earlier, a meeting he had never appeared for, which had at the time been quietly filed away as an unremarkable no-show rather than investigated as the possible warning sign it now appeared to have been. She approached, as well, a young lawyer newly arrived in Silver Wash from Santa Fe, a man with no long-standing loyalty to Boyle's interests and a genuine appetite for a case that might establish his reputation, who agreed, after examining the ledger himself, to take up a formal complaint on behalf of the affected families, gathering their testimony with a patience and legal precision that gave the old grievances, for the first time in 9 years, an actual pathway toward remedy. The commission's renewed investigation, prompted by Vasquez's own detailed ledger and corroborated by the surviving family's testimony and the county's own archived trade records, moved with a thoroughness that Boyle's considerable influence proved unable to fully suppress, especially once the young lawyer ensured that word of the reopened case reached the territorial newspaper, whose story about a vanished trader's long-buried ledger could not be quietly dismissed the way a single widow's private accusation so easily might have been. The investigation concluded, based on the weight of Vasquez's own careful records, that systematic undervaluation had indeed occurred exactly as described, and ordered restitution, calculated as precisely as the surviving records allowed, to be paid from Boyle's own considerable holdings to the families who had been cheated across those years, a judgment that could not undo 9 years of hardship, but that thoroughly and publicly dismantled the reputation for shrewd, honest-dealing Boyle had cultivated for decades. As for Rafael Vasquez himself, no one could say with certainty what had befallen him that autumn night 9 years before, whether he had fled fearing for his safety or met some worse fate on the road to his intended meeting. But the investigation's findings were sufficient to formally clear his name of the theft accusation that had followed him into whatever fate he met, restoring, at Cassandra's insistence and with the young lawyer's help, his reputation among the very trading families who had once trusted him completely. Reuben Boyle's own forged debt claim against Cassandra came under fresh and immediate scrutiny once the broader pattern of his dealings became public knowledge, and a handwriting examination commissioned by the same young lawyer found Daniel's supposed signature considerably less convincing than the circuit judge had originally judged it to be. Facing the near certainty of a formal fraud charge that the newspaper's continued attention made politically untenable to ignore, Boyle agreed to a quiet settlement restoring to Cassandra the full value of her husband's freighting business, along with a public retraction of his original claim. Cassandra did not stop at simple restitution. Working alongside the young lawyer and several of the families who had been most directly harmed, she used a portion of the settled restitution funds, along with Vasquez's own preserved silver, to reopen the trading post exactly as Vasquez had once run it, honestly and transparently, with valuations posted openly for any supplier to examine and a standing invitation for any family along the old route to bring complaints directly to a small oversight committee she helped establish, precisely the safeguard that might have protected Vasquez himself had such a structure existed 9 years earlier. The post, the ruin she had bought for $12 because nothing else in the world was left to her, became once again what it had been in its best years, a place where honest trade could be conducted without fear of quiet exploitation. Its reopening celebrated by the very families whose grandparents had once relied on Vasquez's fair dealing and had spent 9 years believing that kind of honesty had simply vanished from the trade route for good. And so it was that Cassandra Boyle, 36 years old, cast out by a forged debt and left with $13 and a single trunk, became the reason a vanished trader's ruined name was finally restored, and an entire trade route's oldest, quietest injustice was finally set right. The trading post that no one at that county auction had thought worth a second bid had held, behind a single loose stone, not merely a dead man's silver, but 9 years of patient, waiting truth, requiring only a hand careful enough to press against the wall and feel what did not quite belong. Cassandra had inherited her father's conviction that the surface of a thing tells you nothing reliable about what lies beneath it, and it had cost her a marriage's worth of security before it finally gave back, not to her alone, but to dozens of families along an old trade route. A debt owed since 1874, and a good name restored to a man who had waited 9 years for anyone patient enough to look past the too-tidy story everyone had settled for. The auction had ignored the deserted trading post entirely. It would turn out the post, and the truth it had been quietly guarding behind its wall all those years, had simply been waiting for the one person patient enough to press her palm against the stone and feel what lay hidden just beneath. We tell you Cassandra's story not merely because a loose stone and an old trader's ledger make for a satisfying discovery, though they certainly do, but because of what she chose to do once that discovery was entirely hers to keep or to share. She could have taken the silver quietly, restored only her own fortunes, and said nothing further of Rafael Vasquez's ledger at all, and given everything that had been taken from her, few in her position could have been blamed for choosing exactly that. Instead, she spent her hard-won evidence clearing a vanished man's name and rebuilding, from a disgraced trading post nobody wanted, the very kind of honest, transparent trade that an entire rout of families had quietly gone without for 9 long years. That choice, more than the post, more than the ledger, more than the $12 that started it all, is the true inheritance of this story. The understanding that the surface of a thing, whether a stone, a story, or a signed document, tells you almost nothing about the truth waiting patiently beneath it, and that the world rewards, sooner or later, those willing to look past the shine and press their palm against what everyone else has agreed not to touch. Wait, don't click away just yet, because Cassandra's story isn't really over. In fact, this is where it quietly becomes your story. Think about it. For 9 years, an entire town looked at the same building, the same dusty shelves, the same faded walls, day after day, year after year, never realizing they were walking past a secret that could have changed everything. Not because it was impossible to find, but because everyone had already decided there was nothing worth finding. Isn't that exactly how life works? The greatest opportunities rarely announce themselves. They don't come wrapped in bright lights or loud headlines. They hide behind ordinary moments, inside forgotten places, and sometimes, inside the dreams we almost gave up on. The difference between the people who discover extraordinary things and everyone else is often just one decision, one more question, one more attempt, one more look. Cassandra made that choice. What if yours is still waiting? Maybe you've been told your idea is impossible. Maybe people laughed at your plans. Maybe you've convinced yourself it's too late to start over. But remember, every incredible discovery in history existed long before someone finally noticed it. The treasure didn't suddenly appear. The truth was always there. Someone simply had the courage to keep searching. So before you move on today, ask yourself one question. What have I been walking past, simply because everyone else told me it wasn't worth noticing? That single question could change more than you realize. Now it's your turn. Tell us in the comments. What's something valuable you found after everyone else had already overlooked it? Your story might become the encouragement someone else desperately needs today. We read every comment, not because we have to, but because this channel is built around the incredible stories people choose to share. If this video made you stop and think, hit the like button, subscribe, turn on notifications, not just to support the channel, but because the next story we've uncovered may be our most unbelievable yet. It begins with a forgotten object, hidden in plain sight, an object thousands of people ignored, until one impossible detail revealed a mystery no one could explain. When that video goes live, you'll want to be among the first to see it. Until then, keep your eyes open, stay curious, question the obvious, because the next life-changing discovery may be waiting in the very place everyone else already walked away from. We'll see you in the next story.